So thanks everybody for coming. Welcome to the second in our series of lectures about Jewish beliefs about the afterlife. Last month, we spent some time going over a sort of schematic reconstruction of the best guesses that we're able to really make about beliefs in the afterlife that were held by people living in ancient Israel. I frame it that way because, as should have become clear from what we were talking about last month, the Bible itself, the Hebrew Bible itself, is pretty sketchy about what people actually believed about the afterlife. There's very few statements regarding afterlife beliefs directly. And most of what we have in biblical text comes from things that are mentioned obliquely or figures of speech or common expressions that we find in the Bible. What probably all of that indicates is that for people living in ancient Israel, right, the period of time covered broadly by the Hebrew Bible, most people did not really think a lot about life after death, right? By and large, the biblical attitude toward life after death is there probably is some form of continuance after we die, but that it is not in any way a desirable state to look forward to, and therefore, the blessings that we hope for from God all involve being preserved from that future state as long as possible. We're moving on this time into the rabbinic period, which I acknowledge is going to leave us with quite a lot of history to cover after this lecture is over, but that's going to be okay, because the rabbinic period is highly formative for Jewish beliefs about the afterlife. And a lot of what we'll have to talk about next time all kind of hangs together, even though it covers a fairly long stretch of historical time, because it's all going to, like next month we're going to be talking about, most of what we have to cover is going to be covered under the heading of what we might call mystical Judaism, right? But this week we're going to focus on the rabbis, because the rabbis are really where we start to see the development of more sophisticated and detailed beliefs about the afterlife. Clearly something had happened between the end of the Hebrew Bible, right, which historically ends around the time of the return of the Babylonian captives and the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem, right? The generation of Ezra and Nehemiah is about when the Hebrew Bible ends, historically. And then rabbinic literature begins, depending on your definitions, somewhere between 100 BCE and about 70 of the CE, right? So between that time and that time, right, we've got, quite a few hundred years, and things had been developing in Jewish thought regarding life after death, and most of our insights into the way in which that had been developing within Judaism come from the apocryphal literature. We touched a little bit on that at the end of last month's lecture, right? And what we were discovering there is that one of the things that distinguishes authentic biblical literature, right, the literary canon of the Hebrew Bible, from post-biblical apocryphal works, is that apocryphal literature is much more engaged with the idea of life after death and much more concerned with questions of reward and punishment in the time after death. And what we find with the rabbis is that by the time that the rabbis come around, right, the rabbis as a movement are essentially an extension or a development of Pharisaic Judaism from the Second Temple period, but the rabbis really get their start as a defined Jewish movement after the destruction of the Second Temple, around 72 CE. what we find in rabbinic thinking about life after death is that the rabbis are a lot more engaged with this question than their biblical forebears ever had been. They have much more sophisticated, developed, complex ideas about life after death, and they talk about it a lot more than any of the biblical authors ever did. So, the key point that I want to make about rabbinic thought about the afterlife is that the rabbis talk quite frequently about the afterlife. But nevertheless, it pops up quite a bit in rabbinic literature. But nevertheless, rabbinic literature contains no systematic account of the afterlife. This is, in some respects, an extension of rabbinic approaches to theology in general, right? Where it's best to think of rabbinical thought about things like the afterlife or the nature of God or the spiritual world in general, not as a dogma, right? A particular set of defined beliefs that are shared in common by the rabbis, right? And that are considered normative among the rabbis, but rather as a cultural milieu, right? There's a set of ideas and values and principles that the rabbis share in common and that float around among the rabbis, but there are many different versions of these ideas in play. Different rabbis espouse different perspectives, and we never have one single clear, authoritative, systematic expression of this is what we collectively believe about the afterlife that becomes normative within the rabbinic community, right? What we have is a literature about the afterlife which shares some things in common, but there's still a huge diversity of expression among the rabbis on this particular subject. What the rabbis in general agree on is this. One, there is life after death. The rabbis in general agree on that principle, and they consider it to be strongly normative within Judaism. They consider Jews who affirm that there is no afterlife, that there's nothing that comes after we die, they consider that to be a heretical belief, and one that they are extremely down on. And two, they believe that an individual's fate in the hereafter is determined by their deeds in this life. Unlike biblical conceptions of Sheol, right, as a place where everybody goes no matter what, and where everybody's fate is basically the same. It's cold, it's dark, it's boring, right? And that's the case whether you led a good life or a bad life. For the rabbis, what happens to us in the hereafter is determined by our actions in the here and now. The general distinction that the rabbis make is between olam hazeh, which is a Hebrew phrase meaning this world, and olam haba, which in Hebrew means the world that is coming, or more conventionally, the way that people often refer to it in translations and discussions of rabbinical literature, the world to come, right? And so the general term for life after death in rabbinic thought is olam haba. And the rabbis pretty frequently talk about olam haba. So what is olam haba? Here we come to that thing I was talking about, right? This key thing in rabbinic literature, which is where the rabbis have a cultural milieu, they don't have a specific dogmatic set of beliefs. Because within rabbinic literature, we find basically two different, I'm going to say competing, but competing isn't exactly the right word, two different perspectives on what is olam haba. Some rabbinic texts, riffing off of prophetic teachings that we find, for example, in the book of Ezekiel, right, that we talked a little about last month, right? Some rabbinic texts understand olam haba to refer to a future historical time, which will take place after the coming of the Messiah, when God will fulfill the prophetic promise to resurrect the dead. Remember, Ezekiel goes to the valley of the dry bones, and God says, prophesy to these bones and tell them that they will get up and walk. And they get up and walk, right? So, riffing on that as a genuine literal belief, right, the rabbis affirm that in Olam Haba, by which in this sense they mean the time to come after the Messiah arrives, God will resurrect the dead bodily and live in a world that is perfected, kind of a utopian version of our world, right? In Tractate Ketubot, for example, right, there's a text that depicts the Olam Haba, the time to come, as a time. They say in this world, in Olam Hazeh, people have to, go in their vineyard and harvest a bunch of grapes, and they have to put them in the vat and stomp on them, and to make wine, right? In Olam Haba, the grapes are going to grow so big that you'll pick one grape and you'll bring it home and stick a plug in it, and you'll get enough grape juice out of that one big old grape to fill 30 casks of wine, right? In other words, in Olam Haba, there are no cats and the streets are paved with cheese. It's like our world. It's a physical world, but everybody who's dead has been resurrected, and life is a lot better, right? Life is a lot easier. They talk about how wheat, people will sow it and they'll be able to harvest it in 15 days. They talk about how women will have babies every month, which, I don't know, it doesn't exactly sound to me like exactly an easier world, but maybe the rabbis are thinking from a particularly male perspective. In any event, Olam Haba, from this perspective, is not a different world. It is a future world. And in that futuristic utopian paradise, the dead will be resurrected, right? So, everybody will get another chance to live, and we will be living, moreover, in this incredibly peaceful, prosperous, safe, and harmonious world. But a world like this one. The other rabbinic texts understand Olam Haba in a completely different way. In other rabbinic texts, Olam Haba is presented as a spiritual afterlife, which begins immediately after death, right? So here, the emphasis is less on Olam Haba in the future, as Olam Haba, the world that will come after we die. And we can point to numerous rabbinic midrashim that talk about Olam Haba as something that people experience after dying, right? That talk about death is basically like a going to sleep, and we wake up in Olam Haba. There are various accounts of particularly pious rabbis who are on their deathbeds, right? And they are passing away. And then they are smiling, and their students are gathered around them to wish them farewell. And they ask the rabbi, why are you smiling? And the rabbi is like, I can see the treasures that are prepared for me in Olam Haba, right? He's not talking there about, in the far future when my body will be resurrected. He's talking about a spiritual afterlife to which my soul goes immediately upon death. And the curious yet characteristic feature of rabbinic thinking on this subject is that you would think that these two conceptions of Olam Haba, right? What's Olam Haba? Well, I think that it's a future time when people will be physically resurrected and everything is going to be living on Easy Street. Okay, well, I think it's a spiritual afterlife, that I die and my soul goes to Olam Haba, right? Those don't sound like compatible ideas. But for the rabbis, you'd think that they would argue about this. God knows they argued about everything else, but they didn't. Both conceptions of Olam Haba were in circulation within the rabbinic community at the same time for hundreds of years. It's not like we developed from one conception to another even. texts from both perspectives appear throughout the period of rabbinic literature, by which I'm broadly referring to the period of the Tanaim and the Moraim. Texts of both kinds appear side by side in the same communities at the same time for hundreds of years, but there's virtually no evidence of any kind of argument as to which one is the correct picture. So we can ask ourselves, why? Why is it that we've got these two radically different, on the one hand, right, there's a contradiction here, right? On the one hand, the rabbis feel very strongly that anyone who doesn't believe in Olam Haba is a heretic, is not being a good Jew. But on the other hand, the rabbis themselves seem to have radically different pictures about what Olam Haba is, and they don't seem to have a problem with it, right? They don't seem to see that as a contradiction or an issue that needs to be resolved. So here's the reason for this, or at least my take on the reason for this, right? Both of these conceptions, right, the historical Olam Haba versus the spiritual Olam Haba, right, both of those conceptions of Olam Haba, they're different, they differ as to fact, right, but they both support the basic rabbinic ethos of divine reward and punishment. The rabbis' central concern in thinking about Olam Haba, in the world to come, is ethical, not metaphysical. They believe in enough of a metaphysical scaffolding to support a basic ethical idea which they all agree on, which is that a person is judged for their actions that they perform in this world and receives a reward for their good behavior and a punishment for their bad behavior in Olam Haba, in the world to come. That ethical principle is the core of the rabbinic belief about Olam Haba. And the different pictures that the rabbis develop about what that Olam Haba actually is less important for the rabbis to agree on, right? It's much more important to them that people do believe that there is reward and punishment which occurs after death, than that they believe specific things about what the nature of that reward and punishment might be. And so there's a general, as often happens in rabbinic discourse, right, there's a drive toward general agreement on matters of ethical practice and a sort of broadly permissive, speculative, imaginative, like room to explore on matters of substantive fact, right? And that, I think, is really what's going on in rabbinic discourse about the afterlife, broadly speaking, right? The rabbis deeply care that all Jews should believe that there is reward and punishment after death, but they are perfectly happy to let their fancies fly in any direction that they may happen to go in terms of articulating what exactly that reward and punishment might be and when exactly and how exactly it might occur, right? This is the basic dichotomy that we find in rabbinic thinking on most matters of theology, and certainly with regard to the afterlife, to Olam Haba, right? In this regard, this theme of judgment after death and reward and punishment for human behavior seems to be a result of the rabbis' process of historical development, right? I mentioned before that the rabbis are essentially a historical development out of the pre-destruction sect of Pharisees, right? But during the period of the Second Temple, the two primary competing groups of the two primary competing Jewish sects during the Second Temple period were the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees are the ones who eventually developed to become the sort of forebears of what we think of as rabbinic Judaism. And the Sadducees largely kind of like, end up going away For one thing, they're a political party that is heavily based around like the power of the priesthood, right? And when the destruction of the temple, their whole kind of reason for being kind of goes away. But whatever the historical reasons for this, the rabbis who sort of, kind of serve as the basis for rabbinic Judaism, historical Judaism going forward, right, are an evolution of the Pharisaic point of view. And one of the key differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, at least according to the historian Josephus, is that the Pharisees believed in life after death and divine reward and punishment for good deeds and bad deeds, but the Sadducees did not. The way that Josephus describes them, the Sadducees do not believe there is any sort of life after death, that when we die, we just die. And also the Sadducees don't really believe in reward and punishment either. He says that from the Sadducees' point of view, whether we do good or do evil, ultimately that's just, that's a human choice. It's not something that like God is going to weigh in on and cause actual like reward and punishment to happen, right? So that perspective that there is reward and punishment, and that reward and punishment centers around the fate of ourselves after we die, that's a Pharisaic idea, and it's carried forward by the rabbis who see themselves as the inheritors of the Pharisees, and it becomes a key part of rabbinic Judaism, right? While at the same time, specific beliefs about what the nature of Olam Haba is, that is a little bit more up in the air. And it's an area where there's a great deal of rabbinic speculation, right? Okay, so given that there's a wide degree of differences between the rabbis about what this might actually look like, I think it's useful then to kind of look at some different areas of rabbinic statements about life after death to get a sort of general picture of what's going on within this sort of cultural milieu that the rabbis are engaged in and in the process of developing, right? So let's take a look at some of the sort of key points. I'm going to sort of start at the beginning, right? By which I mean the whole issue of life after death begins with death, right? So we should start by talking about death. The rabbis have a great deal of interest in talking about there are a whole variety of angels that the rabbis imagine there being, right? The rabbis seize upon biblical angelology and they carry it forward into all kinds of speculations in mythology about angels. One of the key angels that the rabbis talk about pretty frequently is the angel of death, Malach HaMavet, who is seen as the sort of agent whereby death is carried out, right? There's an angel that's appointed for everything in rabbinic angelology, and of course, there has to be an angel, therefore, who's appointed over bringing about the end of a person's life. So, various things that the rabbis have to say about the angel of death include, they give the angel of death a name. The name that they frequently use to refer to the angel of death is Samael, which crops up later on in all kinds of, Jewish, Christian, all kinds of mythologies and sort of occultism as the name of a devil or an evil angel, right? The name Samael is derived from the word Sam, right, which is a term, rabbinic term for poison, right? So it's basically the poison angel, right? The poison of God is the angel of death. And that's because the rabbis imagine the angel of death going around with a sword that's coated with gall or poison, and that when a person is about to die, they see the angel of death, and they're so afraid that their mouth drops open, and the angel's, the poison drips from the end of the sword into the person's mouth, and say the rabbi, that is what separates the soul from the body, and it is also what causes the body to putrefy, right, to decay, right? So it's sort of a mythological explanation for why do we die, and also why do our bodies decay after we pass away. Samael isn't the only name that's applied to the angel of death. They frequently just refer to it as Malach HaMavet, the angel of death, and also over time, various biblical accounts of sort of scary angels end up getting attached to the angel of death as well, right? So, for example, the Satan, right, the Satan figure who appears at the beginning of the book of Job, is often associated by the rabbis with the angel of death. And also, there are various kind of oblique poetic and prophetic references to things like the destroying angel or the corrupting angel that God might send to inflict punishments on people. And these are often associated by the rabbis with the angel of death as well, in a process that's pretty common in rabbinic thinking, right? Where in order to support rabbinic beliefs about God and the metaphysical world, they seize upon language in the Bible as a justification for their beliefs, in kind of the same way that Ezekiel's vision of the Valley of Dry Bones is used later as a justification for the rabbinic belief of resurrection in the Messianic age. So the angel of death comes and appears to people, and that is how, and drips the gall into their mouths, and that is how they die, right? And so, of course, along with that comes the really central concern for a lot of rabbis, which is how do we avoid the angel of death, right? Because while the angel of death, of course, serves a divine purpose, and everybody's got a time that is appointed, that doesn't mean that we don't necessarily try to avoid that inevitable end as long as possible. And so numerous rabbinic texts deal with the subject of how to avoid the angel of death. Most of these ultimately revolve around doing things like giving tzedakah, giving to charity, or learning Torah, or performing various acts, various good deeds, like gimilut chasadim, on the principle that the angel of death cannot take a person who is actively engaged in performing a mitzvah. There's a rabbinic story that's told about the end of David's life, when David's appointed time had come, that David began to sit and study Torah constantly, like throughout the whole day, right? He would just study Torah and study Torah and study Torah, and he was studying Torah so much that the Malach HaMavet couldn't come and take him, because the angel of death can't take someone, it was believed, who is currently actively engaged in a mitzvah. And so, of course, in those stories, what the Malach HaMavet has to do is resort to trickery, right, to cause distracting things to happen, so that David will be distracted from his Torah study, and the Malach HaMavet can come grab him, right? So this is like a general sort of set of folkloric beliefs that the rabbis have, that like the Malach HaMavet has a time and a place where he is appointed to come for you, but that he can be sort of forestalled in various ways, right? Either by engaging in like a variety of mitzvot, because he can't come and get you when you're actively engaged in a mitzvah, or in certain stories, I'm thinking about one, for example, in Masechet Makot. There's a story about how the angel of death is coming for someone and kind of hanging out in a tree outside the Beit Midrash, but he's like sent away. He can't come in because like the power of the rabbi inside is able to sort of banish him, right? There's a lot of beliefs that the rabbis have that rabbinic wisdom confers basically a kind of spiritual power which gives them the ability to sort of command angels and demons to do their bidding, right? And so a sufficiently powerful rabbi could like send away the Malach HaMavet when it's coming for one of his disciples, right? So there's a lot of folklore here about the angel of death and how to avoid it. But of course, eventually death comes for us all. And so we have the moment here of death. The key rabbinic beliefs regarding the moment of death revolve around this theme of judgment, right? Because remember that the main kind of component to rabbinic beliefs about the afterlife revolve around being judged for one's deeds and being either rewarded or punished. Here's a maybe characteristic example of this. I'm looking here at an excerpt from the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Ta'anit 11a. It occurs in a general discussion of people who ought to, the basic idea in this discussion leading up to this point is that in a time of crisis, when Israel in general is having a terrible bad time, people should not separate themselves from the community, right? If your community is suffering, you shouldn't like go off over here and have a party, right? And then it gets into a discussion about like punishment and how we get punished and like what the mechanism for that is. So here's where it goes from there. And lest a person say, "Who will testify against me?" The stones of that person's house and the walls of a person's house testify against them. As it says, this is from Habakkuk, "For a stone shall cry out from the wall, and a beam out of the timber shall answer it." In the school of Rabbi Shelah, they say, 2 ministering angels who accompany a person will testify against them. As it says, "For he will give his angels charge over you." Rabbi Chitke says, a person's soul testifies against them. As it says, "Guard the doors of your mouth from she who dwells in your bosom." And there are some who say a person's limbs testify against them. As it says, "You are my witnesses, declares Adonai." Right? So thus far, we're talking about the question of like, okay, somebody provides testimony against us in the moment of our death. Who is it that provides that testimony? And there's a variety of different opinions that are stated here, right? None of them have to be authoritative because this is rabbinical thinking we're talking about, right? It's ultimately speculation. So then it goes on to discuss further. "A God of faithfulness without iniquity. He is just and righteous." This is a quote from the end of Deuteronomy. It goes through the text line bit by bit here. "A God of faithfulness. Just as punishment is exacted from the wicked in the world to come, even for a light transgression that they commit, so too punishment is exacted from the righteous in this world for a light transgression that they commit, without iniquity. Just as a reward is paid to the righteous in the world to come, even for a minor mitzvah that they perform, so too reward is paid to the wicked in this world, even for a minor mitzvah that they perform." That may sound a little complicated, but I want to kind of like walk through it just a little bit here because this is actually a key element that crops up numerous times in various rabbinic texts to talk in their discussions of reward and punishment. So what they're saying here is this. A wicked person, in other words, a person who predominantly does bad things, right? They're going to receive all of their rewards for their good deeds in this world. And so in the world to come, they've got nothing to look forward to except for the punishment, right? That's part of how they're being punished, is they get all the reward in this world, and all their punishment is waiting for them in the world to come, even for their minor transgressions. Meanwhile, the righteous, people who generally are doing good things, they get all the punishment that's coming to them for their minor transgressions in this world. And what that means is, in the world to come, they've got nothing but good things saved up for them, right? All of this is in keeping with the general rabbinic belief, and we see various rabbis make this statement, that ultimately, right, the world to come is a better place than this world, right? Whether that's a future time or whether that's a spiritual place, ultimately the rabbis believe that the world to come is going to be a better place than this one. And so ultimately, if we're going to get punished, it's better to get the punishment over with in this world where things are ultimately merely temporary. And like that way, when we come to the end of our lives, we've got nothing to look forward to but rewards, right? And vice versa for the wicked, right? This is probably one approach to the whole general question of tziduk hadin, right? Justifying the judgment. Because remember, the rabbis believe very strongly that God is just, right? Is a righteous judge. And that, of course, raises the problem about why do bad things happen to good people and good things sometimes happen to bad people, right? So part of the rabbinic explanation for this, and we find there's a variety of different texts on this in the Talmud and elsewhere, revolves around this idea that when bad things happen to good people in this world, all that is that God is taking out like whatever minor punishment you may be coming to you in this world to get it over with. And that way, when we pass on and we go to the world to come, we've got nothing to look forward to but a reward. And the reason why good things happen to bad people in this world is because those bad people have a lot of punishment waiting for them in the world to come. And so God's just getting all the good stuff out of the way here in this world, where it's merely temporary, so that they've got nothing but bad stuff to look forward to in the world to come, right? It's a way of explaining certain aspects about this world and kind of justifying why it is that, like, actually everything really fits together and that God is a righteous judge. Continuing on, he is just and righteous. They said, at the hour of a person's departure to their eternal home, all their deeds are enumerated before them. And they say to this person, you did thus and thus, in such a place, on such a day. And the person says, yes. And they say to this person, seal it. And the person seals it. As it says, it shall be sealed by the hand of every person. This is from Job. And not only that, but a person also justifies the judgment upon themselves and says to them, you have judged me fairly, in order to fulfill the verse, that you may be justified when you speak. That one's from Psalms. So what's the general picture that we get from this, right? The general picture that we get from this, and I'm going to re-emphasize here that this is one rabbinic text, and that various rabbinic texts often have different things to say about these subjects, right? But the picture we get here is, I think, emblematic of a certain kind of strain of rabbinic thinking on the subject. That when a person passes away, they undergo a process of judgment. That those who testify against them might include, right, a person's house, or a person's own body, or a person's own soul, or perhaps a couple of ministering angels whose job it is to follow them around all the time during life and write down everything that they did. But whoever is understood in this idea as providing the testimony, right, they bring all the testimony before this person who just passed away, and they enumerate all of that person's deeds. They read out the list of this is your life, right? And that person, having like expired, right? They've got nothing to hide now. They've got no way to, deny all these charges. So that person has to admit, yes, this is all true. I cannot deny it, right? And then that person is asked to put their own sign or seal upon the testimony. In other words, to affirm that this is the truth. And of course, the person is also compelled to say, right, you have indeed judged me fairly, right? In other words, right, a person goes through a sort of like little court session after death, right? And then they proceed to go off to reward or punishment, as the case may be. All right. Let me just check on how we're doing for time. Not too bad. Okay. So we've covered the moment of death here. I want to take a brief moment to talk about the other half of a person, right? Because usually when we think of reward and punishment happening after death, we're talking about the spirit of a person or the soul of a person. But for the rabbis, that's not an unambiguous kind of, there's a kind of ambiguity there as well. Because some rabbinic statements about the subject seem to indicate that at least some of punishment that people are receiving after death is actually happening not to their like disembodied spirit, but actually to the body itself. The rabbis think quite a bit about the process of decomposition that occurs to a person after they die and are buried. And for at least some strains of rabbinic thinking, that process of decomposition may actually play a role in a person's punishment for their transgressions. From this point of view, the body continues to feel pain and discomfort after death, and that the discomfort of burial and decomposition plays a role in atonement for a person's transgressions in life. As the Talmud puts it in Sanhedrin 47b, the atonement of a person for his sins starts from the moment the body begins to feel the pains of the grave. There are various rabbinic stories that attest to the belief that the dead in their graves continue to be aware of what is going on around them. There's a story in Tractate Brachot, 18b, which is particularly interesting on this subject. You can go and look it up if you want. In that story, it relates how a rabbi loaned some money to a woman that he had been living with, and then she died. So he didn't know where his money was. And so what the rabbi did was he went to her grave to ask her. And of course, being a polite woman and wanting to keep her obligation, she tells him exactly where the money was, and he goes to get it, right? There's numerous stories in which someone will overhear dead people talking to one another in a cemetery and derive some kind of useful information from that, or a rabbi goes to talk to a dead person, in their grave to get some piece of information, right? This may seem familiar to you from last month, and it should be, right? Because what we're seeing here is actually a continuation of a series of biblical beliefs, and I think generally ancient Near Eastern beliefs about necromancy, right? That some people at least, are able to talk to dead people, and that in fact that's a defined kind of job in the ancient world. Some people are necromancers. Their whole thing is they talk to dead people in order to get information or in order to ask for favors and things like that. This is generally disapproved of by the Bible, and the rabbis generally agree with that. But there's all kinds of stories about rabbis doing the exact same thing, about going to talk to a dead person when they need to, right? The line, as always in Judaism, the line between unacceptable, biblically prohibited sorcery and perfectly normal, okay, pious, righteous, rabbinic magic is extremely thin and virtually impossible to define, right? Basically, it's if we're doing it, it's okay. If those other people are doing it, it's probably bad, right? The rabbis are constantly doing magical things, despite the fact that on the surface of it, at least, they affirm that various forms of magic or witchcraft are bad and biblically prohibited, right? The rabbinic conception of magic and approach to magic and feelings about magic are exceedingly complex. But one thing we see from a variety of stories is the belief here is that the body in its grave continues to have some kind of awareness and consciousness, even up until the point when decomposition has been fully completed. And at least some strains of rabbinic thinking seem to assert that that process of decomposition is actually playing a role in a person's atonement for their sins. It constitutes a kind of punishment, which is like atoning for a person's transgressions in life. Nevertheless, at some point the body is gone, and at some point, right, huge degree of disagreement between the rabbis about when exactly this occurs. Does it occur after 3 days or 7 days? Like, when does the soul actually leave the body? The rabbis don't necessarily agree on that. What they do agree on, however, is that eventually the soul does depart from the body, and there are, in fact, various rabbinic accounts of a spiritual afterlife that the spirit of a person eventually goes to. The general terms that are used to refer to this, aside from Olam Haba, are, when talking about reward and punishment, the rabbis talk about Gan Eden and Gehenna. Gan Eden means the Garden of Eden, and that's, we're talking about the Garden of Eden from the Bible. Now you may say, okay, well, Leah, the Garden of Eden in the Bible is a physical place where our earliest, the earliest human beings were placed right after they were created and then they were cast out, right? It's a geographical location, right? How is it also the afterlife? Well, it turns out that various rabbinical texts connect the biblical Garden of Eden with the place where the souls of the departed go to receive their reward in the afterlife. Some rabbinic teachings seems to treat Gan Eden as a physical place on earth, and some rabbinic teachings depict it as a spiritual otherworld where the soul goes after death. Over time, there seems to have developed a more complex set of beliefs that understand that there are two Gardens of Eden, right? There's the earthly Garden of Eden, and there's the heavenly Garden of Eden, right? The earthly one is a physical location, and the rabbis have various ideas about where it might be located. Africa is a very popular one for the rabbis. Some of them like to think that it's in Africa. But there's also a heavenly Garden of Eden, where the soul goes to receive its reward. Makes a certain kind of sense linguistically as well. Gan Eden means the garden of delight, right, in Hebrew, right? So that sounds like a place that your soul might go to after you die. There are various texts describing Gan Eden. Most of them are pretty vague. There's a couple of later ones that are very, highly specific and imagistic, right, that talk about, gates of ruby and various, angelic hosts that are, hanging out and, all the varieties of aromatic plants that are so much more beautiful and fragrant than the ones on this earth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those tend to be later texts. A lot of earlier texts tend to emphasize the idea that no one can describe the Garden of Eden that you go to after you die, because Olam Haba is indescribable, but it's still good. We're telling you it's good, right? That development is something we're going to see continue into the Middle Ages, when you start to get very, very detailed and elaborate descriptions of Gan Eden and Gehenna, right? That's a characteristic of rabbinic Jewish thought, where we start to get these like beautifully gorgeous, detailed pictures, verbal pictures of the world to come. You don't get that so much in rabbinic texts. What you do get is some texts which divide the heavenly garden up into 7 different sections, each one higher than the next, and the souls of the righteous are divided into those sections according to their degree of merit, right? Existence in the heavenly garden is imagined as a state of indescribable spiritual bliss and closeness to God. A well-known text in Brachot, chapter 17, page 17a, talks about how all of the usual activities of this life, like eating and drinking and like procreation and all kinds of stuff, none of that goes on in the Garden of Eden. But what happens in the world to come is that the righteous sit in God's, like near God in God's radiance with crowns on their head, right? It's this state of sort of spiritual bliss. There are other texts about the afterlife that depict that spiritual state in a slightly different perspective. These are texts which depict a kind of heavenly academy, where the souls of the departed rabbis sit and engage in Torah study, which may be considered to be a variation on the same theme, right? Maybe on some level, sitting around with crowns on their heads, right? Maybe that's the crown of Torah, right? So there's various rabbinic texts which seem to imagine that the rabbis, at least after they die, go to a heavenly academy where they continue doing the same work that they were doing in life of studying and discussing Torah all the time. Okay, so that's Gan Eden. The opposite of Gan Eden, of course, is Gehenna. The other term is Gehinnom. In either case, what we're talking about is a place of punishment for the wicked. The name Gehenna, or Gehinnom, historically comes from a valley called Ge Ben Hinnom, which is an actual physical place. It is a valley southwest of Jerusalem. You can go there. Like, it is an actual place that you can go to. Ge Ben Hinnom is mentioned in the Bible as a nasty kind of place. The prophet Jeremiah claims that it is a site where child sacrifice had been practiced by some of the kings of Judea, and he pronounces a curse upon it. Probably as a development from there onward, Gehinnom comes to be associated with a mythical underworld to which the soul is banished for punishment after death. In this regard, Gehinnom is very similar to the way that Sheol is seen in post-biblical apocryphal texts, right? It's an underground place, almost always an underground place, although some rabbis claim that it is actually not down but up. But either way, it is a nasty place where the soul goes to be punished after death. Especially when depicted as an underworld like Sheol, rabbinic descriptions of Gehenna tend to involve fire and smoke and darkness, but also hail and snow, right? In other words, all kinds of uncomfortable stuff, right? Either you're burning or you're freezing. It's a really nasty place to be. And there's various rabbinical accounts of like what this place is like and like how nasty it is for people and et cetera. These accounts don't necessarily have a lot in common, right? There's a lot of diversity of opinion about what exactly Gehenna is like. The one thing that the rabbis all seem to agree on, though, is this: that people are sent to Gehenna for various transgressions, including incest, adultery, excessive anger or haughtiness, and disrespecting a scholar. These are texts written by the rabbis, remember. And various texts likewise describe various different ways of avoiding Gehenna, such as doing, the things you can imagine, right? Giving to tzedakah, repentance, sincere repentance, Torah study, good deeds, right? Those things will save a person from Gehenna. What they all agree on is the length of a person's stay in Gehenna, which is fixed at a maximum amount of, anyone care to guess? How long do you get sent to Gehenna if you are a very, very, very bad boy? What's that? I had two ideas. We had forever, and we had 12 months. And the answer is 12 months. That is the longest you get to stay in Gehenna, no matter how crappy a person you were in life. What's that? It is pretty optimistic. It's incredibly optimistic, actually. The rabbi, the most hyperbolic statement on this subject comes, I believe, from Mishnah Edayot, where it is stated that even the generation of the flood, right? Remember, like the Noah's generation, where everybody was so terrible that God decided to wipe out humanity and all life on earth and start again? That generation only stayed in Gehenna for 12 months. And this is ultimately, I think, significant about rabbinic thinking about punishment and life after death, right? Which is, the idea of eternal damnation was completely alien to the rabbinic way of thinking and to the rabbinic conception of what divine punishment is all about, right? The function of divine punishment from the rabbinic perspective is not to inflict retributive pain for its own sake. The function of divine punishment, rather, is to serve as a tool of moral correction and as a vehicle for atonement. The rabbinic conception of punishment is very much a corrective approach and not a retributive approach. It's not, I have deserved eternal punishment because of how terrible I was. It's, I am a bad person, but I need to be corrected. And that is the function of divine punishment from the rabbinic perspective. For most of the rabbis, the idea of eternal punishment would have made no sense, because the reason that we get punished is to teach us and to improve us and to give us atonement for our transgressions. And so, therefore, the rabbis ultimately fix the period of time that a person spends in Gehenna at 12 months. And this applies to everybody. It applies to, like, the most pious rabbi. It applies to the generation of the flood. It applies to Jews. It also, in various rabbinic texts, seems to apply to Gentiles as well, right? Non-Jews also get a maximum of 12 months in Gehenna, right? I will say there are some attempts by various rabbis to carve out exceptions to this. Certain rabbis, there are certain rabbinic texts that try to suggest that maybe there are certain sins and transgressions that are so terrible that a person maybe does have to stay in Gehenna forever. But by and large, the rabbis as a group seem to have reached this agreement that, like, the time that a person ultimately spends in Gehenna is 12 months, because ultimately it's not about just inflicting pain for its own sake. It's about punishment for the sake of correcting and effecting atonement. And so that's the rabbinic conception of hell as such, right? This is part of the reason, incidentally, moving a little bit forward in history, if we want to take a peek over there, right? We've got this practice in Judaism of, like how long do you say Kaddish for a dead parent, right? You say it for 11 months. There's a reason for that, and it's related to these beliefs about Gehenna. The idea is we say Kaddish for our dead parents, at least the folk belief is, that we say Kaddish for our dead parents precisely in order to reduce the amount of time that they will have to spend in Gehenna, or to reduce the amount of punishment that they might receive while they are in Gehenna. And the reason why we say it over somebody for 11 months and not 12 months is because we can't really imagine our relatives being so terrible that they would need the full 12 months, right? This is like the genuine underlying folk belief behind the practice of saying mourner's Kaddish for someone for that period of time. And it is ultimately derived from this set of rabbinical beliefs that we are in fact punished for our sins after death, but that the punishment is limited and finite and never extends beyond the space of a year. Okay, So the proliferation of speculation about the afterlife that occurs in the rabbinic period produced no single generally agreed upon picture. But the ideas that are sparked by these discussions provided inspiration for a great deal of Jewish thinking about life and death that happened in the Middle Ages and later on. Though later depictions of the world to come would grow increasingly elaborate and complex as time went on, the one characteristic that always remains for the remainder of Jewish history up to this day is the rabbinic focus on moral action in this world as the basis and reason for reward and punishment in the world to come. The function of Olam Haba in rabbinic belief was to underscore the notion that we live in a moral cosmos that is presided over by a just ruler who deals with human beings according to their deserts, and ultimately desires not punishment for its own sake, but repentance and moral growth, right? And the part of the reason I'm asserting here that the rabbis were okay with there being such a diversity of different beliefs about the details of the afterlife is because for them, those details were not really the important point. The important point is this idea that we live in a just and moral universe, and that ultimately we can expect a reward for our good deeds, and we can expect a punishment in order to correct us when we do wrong. And that may happen while we are living on this earth, but if it doesn't, that we can nevertheless rely upon it after we pass away. And so therefore, it's also meant, I think, as a way of reducing general Jewish anxiety, right, about a world that sometimes feels scary, chaotic, violent, and harmful specifically to Jews, right? For all their disagreements about the world to come and what the nature of the afterlife was, the rabbis, the general picture that is painted by the rabbis as a collective body is ultimately what carries forward throughout Jewish history and is going to provide the paradigm for later stages of Jewish beliefs about the afterlife, right? And that bifurcated notion of the afterlife, that maybe the afterlife happens to us right when we die and our spirit goes to some place, or maybe it happens to us in the world, in the time after the Messiah comes and God resurrects our bodies and allows us to live in this really great improved world, right? That bifurcation doesn't get resolved at any point in Jewish history. Actually, it stays with us. And later, more systematic efforts to articulate a more clear and comprehensive picture about the afterlife that we find in the Middle Ages, for example, do not really get rid of that dichotomy. What they do is they seek to resolve it, right? Because ultimately what comes to be accepted in rabbinic Judaism for the remainder of Jewish history up until fairly recently is that actually both and, right? The idea that all rabbinic perspectives about the afterlife are generally valid and acceptable, and that ultimately a fully developed picture of Jewish beliefs in the afterlife would include all of them, right? And so we'll find increasingly complex efforts to kind of reconcile all the different pictures of the afterlife we find in rabbinic text later on in the Middle Ages. So next month, we're going to be talking primarily about that, and also about the sort of general development of the mystical perspectives and their influence on Jewish beliefs about the afterlife throughout the Middle Ages and on up into the early modern period. So that's really what I have to say about this subject. It's 10:32. I want to open it up here for a few questions, if anyone has some questions they want to ask, and then we'll bid you all farewell. But I do want to make room here for a few questions if people want to hang around and ask some. So Joe, would you mind being our microphone person? Sure, we've got a microphone. Please wait until the microphone comes to you before talking.
I will talk about it. My mother, remember, Ed, what happened with my mother? And my niece, my mother died, she was in her 90s, and she was in a nursing home, and she was transferred to a hospital. And my niece, I couldn't deal with my mother. Ed was good with my mother, but I couldn't deal with my sister, couldn't deal with it. She was mentally ill, she had not had kids, whatever. Anyway, so my niece took very good care of her. My niece was visiting her in the hospital, and she had just left, and we came up. I'm not talking into the microphone.
It's fine.
And all of a sudden, she died. We were in the room and she died. And I mentioned it here at the temple that her mouth, all of a sudden, the transformation of her, she didn't look like the same person, and her mouth was like, when you were talking about the mouth being pried open, remember it?
Yes, I was right there.
Where it was right there.
Telling the truth.
And I says, oh my God, I says, she doesn't even look the same, and her mouth was like, and so we called my niece, cell phone. She was in the parking lot.
Yeah.
And we said, Lori, we said, come back. I said, Mommy your grandmother just died. And she came back and she looked at us and she says, that doesn't look like Grandma. She said, that doesn't look like Grandma.
Yeah.
I said, I know. So that was the only thing that we ever saw, that we had that experience.
No, and it kind of feels a little reminiscent of those rabbinic stories about the angel of death and the little drop of poison. Yeah, I mean, I think these stories get invented, right, as ways of explaining real experiences that people have sometimes.
Hi, Rabbi Leiah. I just have one question, which is unclear to me. So you have these two conceptions. One is the world to come,
Yeah.
far off, and the other one is the world to come happens right away when you die.
Yes.
So I understand that second conception with heaven, a heavenly vision, and a hell-like vision.
Yeah.
But for those who believe in the world to come is far away, when the bones come back to life, how does punishment occur there? How do they see punishment happening for the person who has not done very good during his or her life?
Good question. Okay, so there are a couple of different approaches to this, right? One approach riffs on some passages which occur at the very end of the book of Isaiah, right? Which talks about how when God has caused redemption to happen, right, the ones who were evil and bad, right, will be burning, basically, and that the righteous will come and, see the people burning because they will continue burning, right? So one approach to this is that, everybody gets resurrected, and the people who get resurrected who are actually wicked are going to just, be punished in a bodily form, right, for some amount of time, right? Whether eternally or whether just for the 12 months, right? It's not, depends. So that's one approach. The other approach revolves around one characteristic rabbinic phrase about the subject of the world to come is that such and such people merit a share in the world to come. Such and such people do not merit a share in the world to come, right? So one way of looking at that is it's talking about reward or punishment in the world to come. But if we've got a resurrection-oriented approach, one way of looking at it is that people who get resurrected are the righteous, and the ones who don't get the ones who aren't righteous don't get resurrected, right? So from that perspective, there is a world to come, but the world to come, that bodily resurrection, only happens to the righteous. So that's a different perspective, which is contained in some, or at least suggested by some rabbinic texts. With regard to that one, of course, that raises the question about, generally the problem for Jewish readers at that time would have been, we accept that all the non-Jewish people are unrighteous and they're not going to get resurrected, right? Because that's typical Jewish kind of parochialism kind of at work, right? But what about Jewish people who are not entirely righteous? What about them, right? And so this is what inspires rabbinic statements that we find, for example, at the beginning of Pirkei Avot, right? Anyone who's done this practice of reading Pirkei Avot between Passover and Shavuot may remember that the reading of Pirkei Avot begins with a rabbinic statement: all of Israel merit in a share of the world to come, right? Everyone in Israel has a share in the world to come. And this is basically a rabbinic formulation that the resurrection will happen for all Jewish people. Really good Jewish people and maybe not so great Jewish people. But that regardless, right, there's a sort of communal resurrection that occurs that comes from a part of being a part of the body of Israel, right? And this, of course, plays into another dichotomy, which I didn't get into too much here, but is also at play among the rabbis, which is some of these texts depict reward as something which is happening on an individual level, right? You did good, you get a reward. You did bad, you don't get a reward, right? But some of these texts kind of seem to revolve more around the idea of the ideas of communal reward and punishment, right? The idea that Israel as a whole gets punished when it does bad, and that Israel as a whole gets rewarded for its good deeds. And those kind of ways of looking at it often tend to be associated with these sort of bodily resurrection, messianic age conceptions, right? Because the whole idea of bodily resurrection and living in a messianic age plays very well into a conception of reward that's a collective communal reward. We all get resurrected as a community and live in this good world that's going to be in the future. So there's a couple of different rabbinic approaches to it, but yeah, one way of looking at it that seems to crop up in at least some rabbinic texts is the idea that people, like if you're operating on a resurrection-oriented theology, then the people who are truly wicked just ultimately don't get resurrected. They don't merit a share in the world to come. Anybody else? Stacy. Wait for the microphone, sorry, yeah.
In our next classes, will you be speaking about Maimonides' perspective or other original thinkers in Jewish thought about what they specifically say?
Yeah, I may briefly speak about Maimonides. Maimonides is is interesting but a little boring when it comes to speaking about life after death, primarily because Maimonides, from his writings, it is clear that Maimonides thinks it is obligatory for Jews to believe in resurrection in the world to come. He also does not seem to personally believe that Maimonides thinks it's obligatory to believe in it, and he doesn't himself seem to believe in it. That's the thing with Maimonides, right? He thinks it's obligatory for Jews to believe in resurrection, but he also seems to consider resurrection to be unimportant and kind of absurd. So there's that kind of bifurcation in Maimonides, which results in him ultimately not being particularly interested in talking about the subject most of the time. It comes from the fact that he's a philosophical rationalist and is not from his perspective, no one should be doing things for reward and punishment anyway. You shouldn't need a reward for doing the right thing. You should be doing the right thing because you are rationally capable of recognizing that it is the right thing to do. And that perspective, which is pretty characteristic of philosophical approaches to ethics and reward and punishment, is not one which encourages Maimonides to think overly much about, reward and punishment in the world to come. But he does affirm that it is obligatory for Jewish people to believe in resurrection. And it is among the 13 principles of faith that he regards as authoritative and obligatory for all Jews to believe these things. Yeah. But we will talk a little bit about Maimonides. We'll talk more, though, about Kabbalistic traditions and various mystical approaches, simply because the Kabbalists were much more interested in life after death than the philosophers were. Yeah. Other questions? Sure, quick.
Really, nobody knows, but I've heard of people that actually were dead and they were revived, with they did something to their heart, and they said they had experiences. They saw the light, or they saw their dead relatives, or
Sure.
So I don't know if that's
I mean, I certainly don't know myself, but
I don't know, but I've seen like authors, somebody wrote a book, a doctor, and he said he had a child that he didn't even know he had, and he had this, I don't know, anyway.
yeah, personally, I can't really comment upon it because it's not an area that I've never personally almost died myself, right? But certainly we do find in the, in rabbinic texts, these stories of rabbis who are like about to die, right? And they sort of catch a glimpse, they kind of tell, oh, I can see the things that are treasured up for that are in store for me in the world to come. So maybe that's kind of similar to some of those experiences people have. I don't know. All right, got time for maybe one more question if anyone happens to have one. All right, cool. I think we're good then. Thanks everybody for coming, and looking forward to the next one. And like I said, next month we will be talking about the medieval period and onward, with a particular focus on Kabbalistic traditions about life after death, because that's where things kind of develop from the rabbis onward, and it gets really interesting and kind of elaborate in that regard. So thanks everyone for being with me today.